Hello and welcome to knowledgebank.pro. Today we're talking about Power BI Smart Narrative Visual. It's a recent addition to Power BI capabilities, so let's take a look how well it works and whether it's ready for prime time. The first thing that you want to do is you want to download the latest version of Power BI Desktop, and once that's done and installed, you want to go to Preview Features and make sure that Smart Narrative Visual is enabled. After that's done, you can add a smart narrative visual to your report by either right-clicking on the visual and then selecting Summarize as an option. Please note that not all type of visuals will support that option, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the future. Another way to do this is you find the smart narrative in the visualization pane, click on that, and that will add a visual as well. The first question you might ask is whether it makes any difference how you add a smart visual to your report, and turns out that it does. If you right click on the visual and say Summarize, that it will create a smart narrative focused on primarily on the insight driven by this visual alone. If you click off that visual and just add a smart visual by itself, that will analyze all of the charts on your page and try to put together a narrative based on everything that it can see on this report page. Please note that it only sees one page at a time, so the smart narrative will be limited to whatever it can see on this page. So now that we've covered how to create a smart narrative visual, let's see how good of a job it does in describing what it sees. So here we have a very simple report. I'm using our coronavirus data set, so I'm trending deaths over time from the beginning to the current date. And I just want to see what kind of analysis smart narrative will provide for me out of the box. So we could see that it created a bunch of different sentences. The sentences that come back by themselves automatically cannot be customized. So the only thing you can customize is the font and the color, which is what I did. You could just basically do Control-A and then pick the size and the font and stuff like this, but you cannot modify those sentences themselves. You can add your own sentences by clicking on Value, and we will talk a little bit more about this later in the video, but for now let's just talk about the auto insights that the visual provides. So let's see what the auto insight looks like right now. So number one, it says that the deaths trended in period from February 1 to today, and the increase is 2000%. So basically we're trying to understand, if I'm looking at the chart versus me reading something in the narrative, am I getting any additional insight in the sentence versus from the chart? By looking at the chart and reading this first sentence, I would say that this first sentence is not very useful. So for now, I'm gonna say that that insight is insignificant. Let's go to the next one. The next insight says that value averaged around 4,000 per day in this range. That could be interesting. I could have plotted an average line through my trend, but that's pretty cool that it calculates how many average cases per day, deaths per day rather, so that's somewhat interesting. The third one, it says the deaths in period experienced the longest period of growth, 5,600 roughly, between February 26 and Saturday, April 4. So basically they're saying that the growth was roughly through this period here. That's interesting. I think I would argue that the growth was all the way through April 17th. So it picked up April 4th, basically this data point, and there was a couple of drops here, and it didn't pick up this as the growth. So I would argue a little bit, but I think I kind of like the approach that it's looking for the longest periods of growth, and it's trying to tell me kind of the dates when that growth occurred. So that it's a probably B plus type of an insight. I think it could be very valuable in a data set kind of like this. And then deaths in period increased for the last 2 days. So you will see that this is kind of consistent with the way this insight works. It always looks at the very last couple of periods and says, okay, was there increase or decrease? So slight increase or increase in the last 2 days, mildly interesting. Now let's see if this insight changes if I select a different country. Now you see that now I've selected US and the distribution of our data changed a little bit. So let's see what this says now. So the first sentence is still not very useful, talks about 92,000% increase. That's really meaningless in this particular case. On average, 1,000 cases deaths per day. That's interesting, somewhat interesting. And then it talks about the growth from March 18th to April. So again, it kind of cuts off here at April 4th. I think a better insight would have included all the way up through April 16th, where I think we saw the biggest growth. Otherwise, so that was an interesting kind of insight with growth. Let's see if I can isolate maybe from April 16th through, let's say, June, when we have a downward trend, and see if the narrative will pick that downward trend and will give us a little bit more insight there. Okay, so now I've picked a different range where you see the trend deaths are going down. So let's see what the insight will say now. So the first sentence, deaths and period trending down by roughly 90%. So that's good. That tells me that cases came down 90%. So when there is not a whole lot of wild swings in the distribution, that is a lot more valuable. Value average 1,300 per day. That's good. And it experienced the longest period of growth between May 10th and May 15th. Okay, so this is kind of not super interesting, right? So if you're telling me that the deaths are down, that sentence, it looks like it's kind of programmatically baked in. So they're looking for a period of growth when they're looking at trend charts. That's an opportunity where to make it a little bit smarter based on the overall trend. And then it says that in the last number of days, deaths decreased in the last 5 days on record. Now let's say I want to add my own insight to this. As I said, I cannot modify the auto insights, but I can click on a smart visual, and I can click on value and add my own metric. So here I could say deaths, which will calculate total deaths. And this will take a look at all of the metrics that I have and see it underlined it as blue. That means it knows what I'm talking about. So I'm going to pick deaths, and I could format that, for example, this way, and no decimal points, whole number, click save. And now after a little bit of fighting with formatting, I was able to add a line that says the total deaths in period was 119,000. And here I could change the period, and you could see how this will recalculate my narrative based on the selection. So that's pretty cool. Although I'm not gonna lie, it took me a couple of minutes of clicking, highlighting, changing the colors, changing the formatting, fighting with this little bit to get it to format this way, as it was as my changes were not sticking. So it was a little bit frustrating. So it's still in preview. Don't expect this to work perfectly and to be super robust. But after fighting with this little bit and having to do Control A's and trying to be creative with how I select my text here, because clicking on this thing and clicking is still not 100% responsive in my opinion. But I was able to finagle it to work pretty well. So here you go. And now let's talk about where else we can add smart narrative. So we already saw how we can add a smart narrative on a trend chart. So you right click, summarize shows up there, and that's all you need to do. If you try to do the same thing on the map, you'll see that summarize is grayed out, so maps do not support this yet. If you try to do this on the funnel, summarize does not work as well. And if you try to do this on a table, you'll notice that summarize does not work as well. So the way I added a smart visual here, smart narrative rather, I clicked on a smart narrative icon in visualizations, and that added my smart narrative. So this smart narrative actually is looking at the entire page, and let's see what kind of insight it generated. So here it says that new cases trended up, resulting in almost 1,000,000% increase. Value averaged 33,000 per day. It does not say which metric it is. I'm guessing it's number of new cases. Then it says that across all metrics, active cases had the most interesting recent trend with 10,000,000% increase in the last 205 days on record. Not particularly meaningful, so it's this trend here to the right. Active cases jumped from 37 to 4 million in our period. Obviously, we could see this here. It's not super insightful, right? So I can confirm that all of this happened, but it's not giving me anything that I cannot very easily notice by myself. This is a really interesting type of insight. In the last day, estimated active cases had the largest increase, while the cases growth rate had the largest decrease. So this is really the kind of insight that I'm looking for. So it says that on the last day this happened. If it could find a period and say, okay, this is a period where the two variables that should be correlated positively were actually correlated negatively, that's the kind of insight that could make this feature super, super valuable. So I haven't seen a whole lot of it yet, but hopefully over time this capability will be added as well. Recovered and total estimated recovered diverged in the most when the two were apart. So without understanding how these variables are meant to work with each other, whether they're supposed to be correlated, whether they're supposed to, one depends on the other, whether there is a bit of a lag, I think it's going to be very difficult when I have a lot of measures in the model or a lot of stuff in a report to really get a meaningful insight. So I could see how it would be very difficult to provide meaningful insight looking at this page. So my advice is this right now. I would only use this in a very simple reports. So if I have a report with 2, maybe 3 charts, where I only use maybe a couple of variables, and those variables have really interesting, very hard dependency on each other, then I think this insight will be interesting. Also, I would be not looking at a very long span of time where there's a lot of variability, a lot of noise, because that confuses this thing again. So remember when we looked at the smaller range for cases, the insight was a lot more meaningful, rather when we looked at the entire year for deaths. Overall, I would say that this is an interesting piece of technology that could be extremely powerful, and I think we all need to start getting familiarized with how it works and the type of capabilities that this allows us to add to our visualizations. Is it ready for prime time? I think you guys would agree with me that it's still in being a preview, it's still very early beta. The insight is not particularly interesting. What I would want to look at distribution of data in this table, for example, and help me find outliers, right? So that kind of narrative would be super interesting. Would say, okay, here in Illinois, you have this going up, but that is going down while this is happening. So point me the data points on this chart that I should be clicking at, right? So that kind of insight would be super important. Right now, it's looking at overall trends and giving me kind of directions overall. Not much of what I cannot see already, but hopefully over time, this will become much better. That's about it for today. Thank you for stopping by, and I look forward to see you come back soon. Thanks. Bye.